Hi, and welcome back to the Festival of Place the Pineapples in association with the Design Council for our keynote lunchtime talk. I'm Christine Murray, Director of the Festival of Place and Editor-in-Chief of The Developer. If this is your first time on AirMeet, I'm going to invite you to introduce yourself and share your comments and swap links in the chat. You can also send our speaker some emojis. They're behind me. You can give it a try, some applause and some hearts and whatever you find there. When it comes to the question period, we're going to be using the Q&A tab. That's great. Thanks for the emojis. It's right above the chat section. There is a little Q plus A. You can put your questions in there and I will put them to Peter after his talk. So around 25 minutes, 30 minutes in. So I hope you will support me in asking some excellent questions today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Barber, the founder of Peter Barber Architects. Peter worked with Richard Rogers, Will Alsop, and Jessica and Wiles prior to establishing his own practice in 1989. He's currently a lecturer and reader in architecture at the University of Westminster and has been invited by the government to lead a discussion on designing for better public spaces. So welcome, Peter.
Hi.
It's great to have you here. So, and look, here's your emoji applause. So go ahead and share your screen. I'll stay with you and then I'll be back afterwards for the Q&A.
How's that?
Perfect. That looks fantastic. So I'll see you soon.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Christine. And thank you very much for the people who've come along to see this. I'm going to show some snaps of our projects, but before we do that, I want to talk about some of the ideas which underpin what we do, some of the sort of ideology, some of the politics which guide us and in a way sort of give us some kind of map for how we proceed in running our practice, but also thinking about design. The first image is of a shot of a march that we went on a few years ago, and it reminds me to talk to you in the first instance about the politics which surrounds architecture, and in particular housing, and the dreadful state that we are in as a city, as a country, and in fact a global problem as well. We have in London, one of the richest cities the world has ever seen, we have 170,000 people who shelter class as homeless, living in insecure accommodation or on the streets. There are 7,000 homeless people living in doorways outside tube stations, in parks, who are street homeless. And it is a scandal. And we as citizens have to take some responsibility for the situation that we're in. It's no good blaming government. We have recourse to the ballot box, we have direct action, and we have a press in order to make our feelings known about this. And yet it goes on. The situation in which we find ourselves is the product of more than half a century now of mismanagement of the land economy in this country and of housing policy. In 1977, nearly half the population of the UK lived in social housing. It's now, what is it, 10 or 15%. That's because they've been bulldozing social housing, and it's because of the right to buy that was introduced by Margaret Thatcher in the 77 Housing Act. Labour have had ample opportunity to remedy this. They haven't. And so we are now in the situation we're in. In my view, the situation is because of ideology. We're incredibly rich city. In the aftermath of the Second World War, an earlier generation was, when the country was broke, when we were building a national health service at the same time, our previous generation were building 150,000 social homes a year. So as I said, by 1977, nearly half the population of the country lived in social housing. But this image is where we are at the moment. And I'm going to read you some words from David Cameron, who in 2016 said this: "Post-war estates across the country are ripe for redevelopment. We will sweep away the planning blockages and take new steps to reduce political and reputational risk for projects, key decision makers and investors. I believe that together we can tear down anything that stands in our way." So we're in an environment where housing is seen as commodity. It's a vehicle for pension funds to invest in, and it's not seen as basic infrastructure, which of course it should be. And the commodification of housing, the neoliberal project, which we seem to have given into, is creating environments like this, where you'll be familiar with this. Many of you were in Battersea in this photograph, but it stretches up the Thames to Vauxhall. It goes across to City Road. All of you will know areas of our city which are being destroyed by global capital, useful businesses, useful homes, fragile local economies are being swept away by what is going on, because we are not planning for the kind of city we want or the kind of society we want. We're allowing the neoliberal sort of financial system to make those decisions for us. And of course, it's entirely abstract, and it doesn't make smart or intelligent decisions. It simply goes in a sort of whirlwind where it will. And the consequences are this. The personal consequences are this. This is a photograph taken a subway a few hundred yards from Apsley House and from Buckingham Palace. And as I say, there are 7,000 people living in this kind of squalor in an incredibly rich city. This is a photograph taken by a homeless person. A friend of mine is a photographer, ran a project with homeless people in which they took photographs of their own homes. This is somebody's bedroom on a sidewalk. And this is somebody else's bedroom. This is a £10 million one-bedroom apartment in Knightsbridge. So we're talking about inequality here, and a system which is allowing inequality to sort of run riot. So that's the sort of bigger political picture. And as I said, I'm not tolerant of the idea that architects should confine themselves to design. I believe we are architects, but we're also, as I say, citizens, and we need to be mindful and active in relation to the things that I've just been speaking about. But to a more sort of conventional architectural discourse, I now show a picture of the city of Naples. And it's an inspiration to me because it connects with a fantastic piece of writing by Walter Benjamin, who in his wonderful book, One Way Street, looks at, in each chapter, a different European city. And in his description of Naples, he teases out the fantastic, extraordinary relationship that exists between people and architecture. And he's talking about an architecture in a city that's permeable, that invites occupation, which really only becomes interesting and colourful and beautiful when it's occupied by people and their lives are overlaid onto the architecture, which hitherto is kind of slightly meaningless. So, the idea that we make our architecture, we create it, we design it, we build it, but then it comes back and it makes us and impacts on us and liberates us and constrains us as well at times. So his quote is this, and he says it better than me, so I'll get to the point. Walter Benjamin, 1924, okay? The passion, and he's talking about Naples, the passion for improvisation demands that space and opportunity be at any price preserved. Buildings are used as a popular stage. They're all divided into innumerable, simultaneously animated theatres. Balcony, courtyard, window, gateway, staircase, roof are at the same time stages and boxes. Fantastic sort of idea about the city as being a theatre where we're both observers and actors. As porous as the stone is the architecture. Buildings and action interpenetrate in the courtyards, arcades and stairways. In everything, they preserve the scope to become a theatre of new, unforeseen constellations. The stamp of the definitive is avoided. No situation appears intended forever. So this description of a city as being dynamic and colourful and lively and imbued with life by people as they occupy it. And that is an idea that's never very far from my mind when I'm thinking about, when I'm confronted with an empty sheet of paper and I start to try and imagine what might happen in the place that we're trying to design. This is a street in Brighton, bring it a bit closer to home. And I just don't think sometimes we don't think enough about things that are very familiar to us. So for me, the street is the basic building block of the city. It's the kind of most important thing that structures urban space. And it's fascinating because streets compress public space into narrow and intimately scaled spaces, which bring people from different backgrounds into close proximity, different racial groups, different social groups, different socioeconomic groups. And so the street can play an extraordinary part in the way that we relate to one another, and it can influence the kind of society that we have and might want. This is another inspiration to me, and it's the last of the sort of abstract, in a way, images I'm going to show you today. It's Gemma Al-Fanar in Marrakesh, and it's for me, public space is kind of fascinating. It belongs to everybody and it belongs to nobody at the same time, and I love that about it. And we just need to be reminded that when we design housing, 70% of all of the buildings in London are houses or housing. So when we design houses and housing, we are creating the city itself. We're designing the streets, the public spaces, the squares. And so to have an understanding of what public space is and an enthusiasm for it, it seems to me is really at the heart of what it is to do housing at any scale. Gemma Al-Fanar, the name Gemma Al-Fanar, one of its translations is a mosque of nothing. And the idea of public space being a mosque of nothing, a place in which people can express themselves quite freely with other people who they're not familiar with and they don't know. And in each night in Marrakesh, and for the last 1,000 years, it's been the same. The little alleyways of the city disgorge into this space, and little pieces of mobile architecture, stages, and circles of people surrounding snake charmers, musicians, artists, temporary kitchens. It's the most wonderful scene. The space itself, which is in the photograph, has its counterpoint in the building behind the photographer, which, you know, in complete antithesis, if this space is about ephemerality and change and constant movement and life, and kind of anti-ideology in a way, the building behind us is the grand Mosque of Marrakesh, unchanged for 1,000 years, 2 meter, 3 meter thick walls, kind of massive, substantial, immovable. And its counterpoint in an idea about public space and what public space can be. So that brings me to the first of 4 projects I'm going to show you today. This is Donnybrook, and the project lies at the center of this photograph. It's made of 2 streets which intersect with little public space. We won it in a competition, and our rallying cry in the competition was, it's a housing competition, but our rallying cry was, this scheme is a celebration of the public social life of the street. And as I say, it's arranged around 2 cross-site routes with an intersection at a public square. And those streets encourage the throughput of pedestrians in particular. It connects the project with adjacent estates and adjacent streets. And that's a really important part of it. Although the architecture is quite unusual and kind of racy, it has a kind of connection in terms of massing, which connects it to the surrounding streets. And it's back of pavement terraced housing. There are no front gardens here. The orthodoxy at the time was that it should be front gardens, but we designed it in a way which gave a very intimate relationship with the street. And we employ in Donnybrook, it looks like a row of houses, but actually it's not, it's cottage flats. And in relation to the discussion currently kind of raging about pour doors, this is a project which has no common area circulation. Every single door, as with this Edwardian precedent, opens out into the street, so there can be no pour doors. People are visible to one another, people from different backgrounds. There's social housing here, and there is private housing here. They share the street together. It's a project which uses roof terraces, and we're able to show precedents of roof terraces as well. This is Pullen's building down in South London. Some of you know Elephant Castle, and a wonderful precedent. And there it is built. As I say, the architecture and materiality isn't contextual, but in terms of its scale, its massing, and its connection created by the streets that run through it, it's very, very strongly connected with the surrounding area. You can see it better there. These photographs were taken the day it was finished. I'll skip over that one. But as people started to move in the manner that I think Walter Benjamin would have approved, it becomes kind of more interesting as people take over the terraces and courtyards and the street edge. and the shops. And one of the features of the project is that each door has a little window in it, which we thought was a clever way of making it possible for people to answer the door and see who was standing outside, because nobody wants to be seen when they answer the door. So what's happened down at Donnybrook, and we hadn't predicted it, is this. And every single door, every single time I go down there, there's this lovely, there's the architect's house. I wonder who lives there. That's what's happening. Here we are. Slightly scary. So this brings me to the next project, which is Beverage Muse, which is down in Stepney. It's a post-war estate, and we were asked to look at the garages and stores that lay at the back of the site. And it's another project which is all about the connection between the buildings that we're proposing and the surroundings. There it is, as it is at the moment. We were really fascinated by these fences and the kind of make do and mend kind of vibe of people's gardens, what they've done with those. And that in a sense became the inspiration for the project, because what we did was we said that the fences, which were at the bottom of this drawing, would extend round and become the building itself. So we built the thing in timber, with the hope that in time those roof terraces and those spaces within the building would become as fun and as colourful as the gardens which they sit next to. And there's the thing begins to develop, people taking control of those terraces and those front gardens and so on. These are all very large houses. It's social housing for people moving out of overcrowded accommodation within the estate itself. And there's a lovely scene in that garden that we created between the existing and the new residents, a little playground. And so it becomes like a gift to existing residents. It's not something that kind of impinges on them. It's not something that's pushed onto them. It becomes part of their world. I'm going to take you back. I don't know whether I should do this, but so that space becomes a space that's shared by the new residents in our wooden building and the existing residents in the existing estate, and therefore it's a good news story for people who live there. This is a project at another scale, and unlike the other ones, it's a bigger apartment building, but it has many of the characteristics of our other projects. It's still street-based housing. Rather than a single point of access in the middle of the plan, there is access into courtyard maisonettes all the way around the perimeter of the building. So again, we don't have difficulties with having to create separate spaces and entrances for people in different tenures, because people can walk into many of these flats directly from the street. So it is possible to do apartment buildings without running into difficulties again with the management systems and so on. I mean, my thing about the poor doors is it's more of a symptom, and why I started with the sort of preamble that I did about the politics of space and about the economics of housing, is that none of this would be a problem if we didn't have such a big problem of inequality in our society. We can solve these. We need to solve these problems at a macro level, and you know, the way the building's arranged is part of that. But we have to tackle things at a, as I said, a macro level. So there it is again at the bottom of this photograph, entrances into little houses all the way around the perimeter of the building. I'm going to show some images of a homeless project that we've done for Camden. This is social housing writ large. Most homeless projects look like this inside. It's a brutal environment. There are rows and rows of doors off corridors, often very light, very dark, very little natural light. Many of the people living in these places are amongst the most vulnerable in our society. Mental health problems, real difficulties at home, and you know, the harrowing experience of homelessness. So this is the last sort of place that people should be living. And these are two hostels that I know. When we came to do Holmes Road in Kentish Town for Camden Council, we introduced to Camden the possibility that it could be more like this. This is traditional almshouses, actually in Holland. And Camden, bless them, this is the main building, but at the back there was a significant site stretching back from the main road. And so all those little things around there are tiny houses around the garden. And amazingly, Camden were persuaded that this would be a smart idea. It's pretty much hasn't been done for, for a long time, or very sparingly. The idea that each homeless person might have their own front door off a garden into their own little house. This is a kind of reception area. It's not actually the one at Holmes, but it's very similar to this. And there is the overall view of the project. And I'm going to read you what we said to Camden when we introduced the idea at the sort of first meeting. And we thought it was going to be a tall order to persuade them, but they were persuaded, and it's to their credit that they were. There are still some people in local authorities with the residue of a kind of welfare state idealism, and it's so refreshing to find. We imagine a group of residents working with a gardener to create and maintain an intensely planted and beautiful garden with an apple tree or two, potatoes, green veg, soft fruit, herbs, a greenhouse, a potting shed, and sunny spot to sit and rest. We think there ought to be a little room or shed in the garden for private one-to-one chats and counselling. Conceived as the social heart of the hostel, the garden creates a homely domestic atmosphere. It gives participating residents an interest and an outlet for their energy, helping to foster a sense of belonging, self-worth, and empowerment. And this is a garden project we've introduced at one of our other hostels. And in time, we hope the same thing will happen in the spaces we've created here. This is, they're planning to sort of make a start on it this summer. Looks bare at the moment, but one hopes to go back and later on in the summer and for this to be kind of quite overgrown. Images of the houses themselves. They're tiny. They're like sort of multi-story caravans. But they're temporary accommodation. I mean, it's very common to go to hostels and people to be sort of holed up in their rooms all day long, sitting in the darkness with the curtains closed. It seems to me that in an environment like this, it's less likely to happen. This is the last set of slides, and I'm going to rattle through them quite slowly because our time's sort of up now. And this is a proposal we made for the Mount Pleasant site in King's Cross, the contested site. It was a site that is being built out now very differently. But we reckoned, and this is just down the road from our offices, so I couldn't really resist it. We reckoned that we could get the same number of units, about 600, I think it was, with a street-based proposal, which had at its heart 2- and 3-story courtyard houses, and around the perimeter, 6- and 7-story apartment buildings. It would be social housing, and it would be a workspace at reduced prices for small businesses. And each one of those is a little alleyway that kind of runs east-west across the site, so very permeable. And people say, well, you can't have 2-meter wide streets in London. I said, well, look, let's look at Artillery Row. Who can afford to live there? What about Covent Garden? So there are loads of examples of very intensely and densely packed bits of London where the real estate is amongst the most valuable in our city. As the plan of our idea, you can see the kind of north-south route kind of snaking across the site. This is the line of the old Fleet River, and these much narrower alleyways crossing left to right and connecting adjacent neighbourhoods. It could have been really something, really something special. And the rooftops of all of the buildings and all the courtyard houses in the middle would become gardens. So from above, this would be an extraordinarily sort of colourful scene, and one which would sort of encourage biodiversity and so on. So there we are. It didn't happen, but we're always looking for the next site and the opportunity to kind of do something like this. And we are working on projects a bit like this at the moment. a very interesting period. Watch this space. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Peter. Really wonderful to see all of those projects and, of course, to hear from you about some of the thinking behind it. You said right off, we talked about housing, that you said right away, you started with that preamble because corridors are a symptom and not a cause. Or sorry, not the illness. But I was wondering whether there is a perception, we ran quite an intense piece on it, that there is this issue, of maintenance. There's this issue of who runs which bit. And do you find that doors on the street is the easiest way to overcome that perception that it's impossible any other way?
Yeah. Well, an idea about a better integrated society is the thing that drives my enthusiasm for street-based housing. But it does have tremendous advantages for our clients, whether they're a local authority or developers, because local authorities are doing housing of different tenures also. So this is a challenge for everybody. And if you do street-based housing, it makes it much easier to organize things, as you say, from a sort of from the point of view of different tenures. But the other great thing for a sort of commercial perspective is that you're not building all that common area circulation, which costs money to build. I mean, in a typical apartment building, 25% of the space of that building is corridors, it's stairs, it's lifts, and it's decks, which are of no use to anybody. They're spaces that have to be maintained, and they're spaces that they have to be built. And so, put simply, a £5 million project, if you were able to eliminate the circulation, costs £4 million, because 20% or so of that space doesn't need to be built anymore. So there are really good commercial imperatives, as well as the sort of bigger social ones.
On commercial imperatives, there's a question here from Peter Smith, who talked about whether you've attempted to developing those ideas with a private client, and how would you approach that conversation about perceived value? And I'm assuming that is, related to some of those tight spaces in tight alleyways. Yeah,
I mean, some of the projects that we're proudest of, and some, the most recent ones, are being done with a private developer, and he's very happy not to be building out tons of circulation space, and he's very happy not to be having awkward conversations about how you manage lift wells and so on. And he sees no downside to people walking, well-off people and less well-off people walking down the same street. And that's, the streets that we're designing with him are ones that anybody in the neighborhood you don't know who's going to be walking down that street. And you'd have to be pretty, the outcome of being negative about streets and saying that, we can't have different people from different backgrounds walking down the same street is sort of gated communities and apartheid. So if you can't get your head around a street, then we're in all sorts of difficulties. So Kurapatwa brothers, who we're working with on a number of a number of mixed tenure projects, have a great enthusiasm for our approach, because it suits them down to the ground. And they're doing 50% social affordable housing in their projects and making it all stack up. So, as I say, some of our most challenging and interesting projects are being done with a private developer.
There's a comment here from Sarah Jones Morris, who wanted to ask about the pressure to build over 6 stories in cities, and how do you frame that argument? Everyone wants to lift your arguments. How do you frame that argument against going above 6 stories? Because it seems though the majority of projects seen in the presentation were 6 and under.
Well, I think I think we try to tailor you'll see behind me models, and we try to tailor our projects to particular locations. And, sometimes that needs to be 6 stories, and sometimes it needs to be 1 story. I mean, and people grumble, they see our project, they're, what are they building 1 story for? And you say you need to see the context. We're in people's back gardens here, and it just would be, it's extraordinary we've managed to get that in. I don't have a problem with taller buildings. For me, it's how they hit the ground. And, I don't think many people would grumble about living in a tower block on Park Lane. It's about how these buildings are managed, or indeed in New York, and it's how buildings are managed, but also their relationship with the streets and with public space. And although we haven't built a taller building yet, sometimes they form part of proposals that we've made. The other thing to say is that some people love the idea of living on the 20th floor of a block, and I think the idea, which is a mistake that a lot of people make, they try to say what housing should be, and I think that people want all sorts of different things from housing. You know, for some people, like me, for instance, I wouldn't like to live at the top of the block, so I'd feel isolated by that. And my house is on the edge of a street. There's no front garden, and it opens straight out onto the pavement, and that's how I like it. But that wouldn't be everybody's cup of tea. And so I think we need to do all sorts of different types of housing. Courtyard housing, which looks inward and feels protected. You know, back of pavement terrace houses, which kind of belong to the pavement. Higher rise, which enable people who are just utterly pissed off with seeing other people all day long at work, want to be on their own with the horizon. That's fine too. And it's one of the problems I have with design standards, is that they tend to sort of limit, they suggest that there's a sort of Mr. and Mrs. entirely normal. And I don't think those people exist. I think we're all different, or there are, lots of differences.
Of course, those design standards are supposed to prevent a race to the bottom that you've identified in some places. So what would you propose is the most successful way in terms of planning or policy that we could, prevent the kind of terrible design and inhumane conditions in which even some newly developed properties put our citizens into?
Yeah. Well, I had an idea about one sort of type of, and it's sort of become reality a little bit, but the idea that we could try to frame policy which would make it easier for individuals and groups of individuals to form cooperatives and build housing which suits them. And one of the reasons why we get rather generic housing is that there is always an attempt by whoever's developing that housing to make it suitable for as many sorts of people as they can. And I think that we need to question the whole means of production of space and wonder about a different way of doing things. I think it's Uruguay, 60% of all the social housing is done by small cooperatives. You can get money to get land and to hire your own designers, and small groups of people get together and working out what they want from their homes, I think would be a very interesting, if I've waxed lyrical about the post-war social housing boom and program, and in many ways it's beyond reproach, but it definitely was a kind of top-down and kind of heroic kind of top-down process. And I just wonder about if there's to be a new social housing program, whether it might be more local, whether it might be more sensitive to the needs of individuals. It's a tough thing to balance, and in the end, I believe we have to have a planned economy and a planned city. But within that, I think there needs to be more scope for people to have the housing that they would like. And if we could empower people to make that happen for themselves rather than handing it down to them, that would be amazing.
Stephen Taylor's asking, what are your thoughts on how we can dramatically scale up these kinds of interventions in our cities? So one of them is, you're saying, put more power into smaller groups and cooperatives, but do you have other ideas about how we...
It's money. It's money. We need, there needs to be a social housing program, and the only way to scale that up is for money to be put into social housing by central government. And it's a matter of politics and money. And it's doable. If they could do it, as I said, if they could do it in 1945, when this country was on its knees, we can do it now.
And we've seen many a magic money tree shaken this year to do all sorts of different things. So it seems to me that housing has been deemed unworthy of the kind of magic printing that we've seen. There's a question here about whether you can conceive of a future where housing in this country is not traded as a commodity.
Well, it's interesting, very interesting. Yeah. Well, the system as it is not working. patently it's not working. So we do have to think radically about what we do, and never say never. It's so much a part of our culture that and I've talked about sort of pension funds and so on, pointing the finger at them, but we could all point a finger at ourselves, and we're so indoctrinated, post 77 by the idea that the only way to be secure is to own our own home. If you go to Vienna, they didn't do what we did in 1977 in Austria, in Vienna. They looked around themselves, and cities all over Europe were saying, well, we're going to have to sell off our social housing. They didn't do it there. So from having 50% social housing in Vienna, that figure has climbed since then. And social housing there's no downside to it. Everybody wants to live in social housing because it's an inexpensive way of living in really high quality housing. And if we could reframe things like that, then people might be clinging less to their sort of private property in the way that, and I'm part of that, we do at the moment. But it's another
do we need a cultural shift to become a country of renters? It's kind of happening anyway, but there are people holding on to that land ownership. Do you see land ownership reform as necessary?
I think it has to be a public housing project. I mean, I think it remains to be seen how the private rental sector pans out, and maybe that's part of the picture. But I don't think there is any substitute for doing what we did 50, 70 years ago and build a lot of social housing. I think that the three things that need to happen. One is we need to build 150,000 homes a year. We need to end right to buy, which undermines all of our efforts to create social housing. They finished it in Scotland. They don't have it in Wales anymore. So what's England doing? And so local authorities are sort of desperately trying to build social housing, and it just sort of disappears 3-4 years down the line. So that needs to end. And then I believe that rent controls in the private sector are also part of the picture. And if those
you mentioned that Labour had the chance to fix it and didn't fix it, but that our power remains at the ballot box. Where do you see, our best hope for a power shift or a policy shift?
Well, it remains with Labour, I suppose, although, in common with lots of people, one's concerned about the way it is at the moment. But and I'm quite surprised that the Green Party we haven't seen it in the ascendancy more. I think the sort of ecological emergency is so central to everything that it surprises me that we're not seeing the Greens grow, but that may happen.
I wanted to talk to you about the kind of landscaping strategy and a gardening strategy. It seems to vary. Is maintenance a real issue in some of your mixed schemes in terms of what's asked of you? And do you see a shift post-COVID towards maybe furrier, more biodiverse landscapes?
Well, our approach to housing achieves density by being, as I say, rather low rise, but a great deal of site coverage. So our streets tend to be rather narrow. Our public squares are quite intimate, and so there isn't acres and acres of public space to maintain. But we tend to give it over to people's own gardens and courtyards, sometimes front gardens or roof terraces, and therefore the issue of maintenance becomes principally something for people as individuals to do what they will with their garden. However, I showed the Holmes Road homeless project, and that is relatively recent in terms of people moving in, but our Mount Pleasant project is another one round a courtyard, and I went there a couple of years ago doing open house, and I said to one of the residents, why aren't you planting up these flower beds and stuff? So they said, well, we haven't got any money. So I said that we as a practice would provide some money and get involved with helping them make a garden there. And it didn't cost a lot, but one of the photographs I showed there was a photograph of that garden. And it was a brilliant, thinking about architects rolling their sleeves up a bit and getting get more involved with residents and so on. It was the most joyous thing. My partner and I went to the market with the guys and bought loads of plants and came back and planted them and developed friendships and around that experience, which were incredible, and getting to know people's stories more. So I think gardening's good.
Has anything else changed for you post-COVID, just in terms of thinking about the home working, the shift? Do you think that will influence your design, your experiences of this year?
Well, we've got to do a presentation to a house builder in a couple of days' time, and I was thinking of asking them that question actually, because they're very sort of marketing orientated, and they'll be picking up things like that. And I mean, they have said to us, and when we developed the scheme, we're looking at doing more houses. One of the reasons we come to you is we know that you can do houses at very high density. And that also, I think the enthusiasm for the street, if people, I mean, I've noticed it in Brighton, where I spend a lot of my time, our streets changed a bit. People are spending a lot of time there. People leave their, if their gardens don't face the right way, they'll come out and sit at the front. Sometimes in the evenings, the little knots of people standing around on the street having a glass of beer, and so maybe the street can help with that as well.
We're becoming front stoopers in some neighborhoods.
Well, exactly, which has always been a type that I've been fascinated by, actually. And one of the problems with trying to do, I didn't show you McGrath Road, but our attempt to do the sort of front stoop, one of the important sort of characteristics of the stoop is it's just raised up a foot or two above the street, and I think that's an important component of it. That's hard to do in a sort of level access world. But I think the front of people's houses and their relationship. I mean, so for some people that that COVID's meant, well, I want to leave, I want to get out to the countryside. But for me, the city has been a lifeline, which has prevented me from feeling isolated, and just to know there are other people around, and at a safe distance to be able to see them and chat to them, and it has been a really important part of getting through this experience.
Yeah, and I think for me, the social safety net that other people in the city, especially if you don't know anyone in the middle of nowhere, the city can provide a certain solidarity where neighbors who also perhaps don't have family nearby and perhaps don't have the same level of connections can come together to improvise care and improvise gardens and do all of those things.
Absolutely.
There's a technical question here from Siobhan McChrystal. She wants to know
God. Alice, are you listening?
No, it's not too bad. It's just, where is the third scheme? The case study example of an apartment building being street-based housing. Is that the South London? Is that going to be Peckham, maybe?
Peckham, yeah. What was the question about Peckham, though?
Just where was it?
Yeah, 95 Peckham Road. Peckham Road, maybe.
And it was how many apartments do you?
I think it's about 50.
And how many of those are on the street?
A quarter. Probably, okay. and then there are two. I mean, a lot of people would have done the remainder of the building with a single core. There are two cores. I think a lot of the social housing is accessible directly from the street, but it's not presented a problem.
Perfect. There's a few chat comments. Benjamin would like to see more larger spreading canopy trees in your schemes, to be lovely to sit in the shade and in the communal areas. So you've got a request for bigger trees.
Yes, well, I think that's. I mean, you'd be amazed the number of times. I mean, we love street trees. The number of times the street trees grow in, and the council says we're not having any. We don't want any. We're not having any trees on this street. We can't maintain them. I mean, really, yeah. I mean, and our developer clients, we'd really like to put the trees in. So that's not unusual for that to happen. So but I agree. Yeah, more trees. Are
there other climate considerations that you're particularly thinking about at that point in terms of resilience? I mean, we had some crazy flash flooding the other week in London, but I too soon to be informed by that. But just in terms of general drainage and adaptation as a practice, what is your current thinking on changing the way you work or design around climate resilience?
Well, I mean, the flood risk thing, it's quite onerous already, and we have to demonstrate, and sometimes it means you're going up a couple of steps into the into the project to avoid issues, even very unlikely issues of flooding. We are experimenting with types of housing which have very low, and this isn't the case with all of our stuff, very low ratio of floor space to external wall. So in other words, a rather simple envelope which makes heating and cooling easier. And again, I didn't show McGrath Road, but that's a project of houses, 4-story houses back to back. So you're halving the amount of external wall by putting the buildings entirely back to back, touching at the back, but still by a number of tricks making them dual aspect. And I think Alice and I were talking about it earlier on. The idea that I think sometimes ecological concerns can zoom in very tight and become about the sort of U value across a wall. And I think the climate emergency is a much bigger sort of cultural, economic. We need to think big in terms of the way that we're living. And sometimes it's a bit of a bean counter's refuge. You get in so close to your beautiful, well-insulated house that you forget that you're looking at a house on a hillside, and just out of the photograph there are 2 or 3 Range Rovers, and that this wonderful eco house is not as eco as it might perhaps appear. So I think we need to sort of pan back, rather as I have done in talking about housing in general, and think about systemic stuff as well. I
think you've kind of thrown down the gauntlet that architects should be political, as well as, and to act as citizens as well as to act as designers. So I think that is that maybe that speaks to dealing not only with the micro detail of what they're designing, but also with the macro issues and engaging with that dialogue.
Well said.
Sarah Jones Morris wants to mention there hasn't been an almshouse charity formed in over 10 years, and there have been some criticisms of them. But is there a future time for a new model of almshouse, and what might that be?
Well, our almshouses are run by a local authority, and I think that's a good one. I suppose originally almshouses were much more devolved by sort of parish. And whether there's a sort of structure, whether it is the parish, or whether there's a sort of political structure which would be good for administering almshouses on a more kind of local scale. But and we're only calling them almshouses. It's a sort of typological kind of. It's a shorthand for little tiny houses around a square, really. And I'd rather. The other thing is, I'd rather call them cottages any day than micro bloody house. I hate that word, micro houses. It just seems so sort of anemic and kind of functionalist. And I'd rather live in a cottage than a micro house. Okay, no more micro houses, just cottages. Peter, it's been so great having you here. There's actually a storm rolling in here, so but luckily the lightning's not going to hit. London, then you should be in London. Should be in sunny London. So it is the end of our session. So yes, lots of emojis coming for you. Thanks so much for appearing with us today, and for answering all of these questions, and for sharing some really inspirational projects with us. And we hope to see so much care, attention, and dignity coming forward in the housing that we see being developed across our places. And I don't hold out too much political hope, but as you said, the power for our influencing politics lies with us. So we'll join you in calling for some change. So thanks very much. And for everyone here, we're going to be back at 3 o'clock to announce the winners of all this week's pineapples with a special celebration. So do join us at 3 p.m. back on this link to find out who is taking home the golden pineapples for place. Okay, see you then.